Welcome to Christmas story time with Magical Mrs Hutchins. How are you today? Are you well? You are? Fantastic. Well, today's Christmas story is going to be Mrs Pepperpot's Christmas. So if you're sitting comfortably, I shall begin. Mrs Pepperpot's Christmas, written by Alf Proysen and illustrated by Hilda Offen. There once was a little old woman who went to bed at night like everyone else, but sometimes in the morning she would wake up and find that she had shrunk to the size of a pepper pot. As it happens, her name was Mrs Pepperpot. This was one of those mornings, and Mrs Pepperpot climbed to the top of the bedpost and swung her legs while she wondered what to do. "What a nuisance," she said, "just when I wanted to go to the Christmas market with Mr Pepperpot." She wanted to buy a sheaf of corn for the birds' Christmas dinner, and she wanted to get them a little birdhouse where she could feed them every day. The other thing that she wanted was a wreath of mistletoe to hang over the door so that she could wish Mr Pepperpot a happy Christmas with a kiss. But Mr Pepperpot thought that this was a silly idea, quite unnecessary, he said. But Mrs Pepperpot was very clever at getting her own way. So, even though she was no bigger than a mouse, she soon worked out a plan. She heard her husband put his knapsack down on the floor in the kitchen, and quick as a flash she slid down the bedpost, scuttled over the doorstep and climbed into one of the knapsack's pockets. Look, can you see? There she is. She's climbing into the pocket on the front of the bag. Oh. Mr Pepperpot put the knapsack on his back and set off through the snow on his kick sledge, while Mrs Pepperpot peeped out from the pocket. "Look at all of those nice cottages," she said to herself. "I bet every one of them has a sheaf of corn and a little house for the birds, and they'll have mistletoe over their doors as well. No doubt. Well, you'll have to wait until I get home and I'll show them," she said. At the market there were crowds of people, both big and small. Everyone was doing their Christmas shopping, and there was plenty to choose from. At one stall stood a farmer selling beautiful golden sheaves of corn. As her husband walked past the stall, Mrs Pepperpot climbed out from the knapsack and disappeared into the biggest sheaf of all. "Hello, Mr Pepperpot," said the farmer. "How about some corn for the birds for Christmas?" "Oh, too dear," said Mr Pepperpot gruffly. "Oh, no, it's not," squeaked the little voice of Mrs Pepperpot. "If you don't buy this sheaf of corn, I'll tell everyone that you are married to a woman who shrinks." Now, Mr Pepperpot hated people to know all about his wife turning small. So when he saw her waving from the biggest sheaf, he said to the farmer, "I've changed my mind. I'll have that one, please." But the farmer told him that he'd have to wait in the queue. Only a little girl saw Mrs Pepperpot slip out of the corn and dash into a birdhouse on Mr Anderson's stall. He was a carpenter, and he made all of the birdhouses look just like real little houses with doors and windows for the birds to fly in and out of. Of course, Mrs Pepperpot chose the prettiest house. It even had curtains in the windows, and from behind these she watched her husband buy the very best sheaf of corn and stuff it into his knapsack. He thought his wife was safe inside, and he was just about to get on his kick sled and head for home when he heard a little voice calling him from the next stall. "Hello, husband," squeaked Mrs Pepperpot. "Haven't you forgotten something? You were going to buy me a birdhouse." Mr Pepperpot hurried over to the stall. He pointed to the house with the curtains and said, "I want to buy that one, please." Mr Anderson was busy with his customers. "You'll have to take your turn," he said. So once more, poor Mr Pepperpot had to stand patiently in a queue. He hoped that no one else would buy the house with his wife inside. But she wasn't inside. She'd run out of the back door, and now she was on her way to the next stall. Oh, crikey. Here there was a pretty young lady selling holly and mistletoe. Mrs Pepperpot had to climb up the post to reach the nicest wreath, and there she stayed hidden. Soon Mr Pepperpot came by, carrying both the sheaf of corn and the little birdhouse. The young lady gave him a dazzling smile and said, "Oh, Mr Pepperpot, wouldn't you like to buy a wreath of mistletoe for your wife?" "No thanks," said Mr Pepperpot. "I'm in a hurry." Swing high, swing low, I'm on the mistletoe, sang Mrs Pepperpot from her lofty perch, and when Mr Pepperpot caught sight of her, his mouth fell open. "Oh dear," he groaned, "this is too bad." With a shaking hand, he paid the young lady the right money and lifted the wreath down himself, taking care that Mrs Pepperpot didn't slip out of his fingers. This time there would be no escape. He would take his wife straight home, whether she liked it or not. But just as he was leaving, the young lady said, "Oh, sir, you're our 100th customer, so you get a free balloon." And she handed him a red balloon. But before anyone else could say Jack Robinson, Mrs Pepperpot had grabbed the string, and while Mr Pepperpot was struggling with his purse, gloves and parcels, his tiny wife was soaring up into the sky. Look, there's Mrs Pepperpot, and there's the big red balloon. Up she went, over the marketplace, and soon she was fluttering over the trees of the forest, followed by a crowd of crows and magpies and small birds of every sort. "Here I come," she shouted in bird language, for when Mrs Pepperpot was small, she could talk with animals and birds, and a big crow cawed, "Are you going to the moon on that balloon?" I wonder if she is. "Not quite, I hope," said Mrs Pepperpot, and she told him the whole story. The birds all squawked with glee when they heard all about the corn and the birdhouse she had got for them. "But first you must help me," said Mrs Pepperpot. "I want you all to hang on this balloon string and guide me back down to my own doorstep." So the birds clung onto the string with their beaks and claws, and as they flew down to Mrs Pepperpot's house, the balloon looked like a kite with fancy bows tied to its tail. When Mrs Pepperpot set foot on the ground, she instantly grew to her normal size. So she waved goodbye to the birds and went indoors to wait for Mr Pepperpot. It was late in the evening before Mr Pepperpot came home, tired and miserable after searching everywhere for his lost wife. He put his knapsack down in the hall and carried the sheaf of corn and the birdhouse outside. But when he came in again, he noticed that the mistletoe had disappeared. "Oh well," he said sadly, "what does it matter now that Mrs Pepperpot's gone?" He opened the door into the kitchen, and there was the mistletoe hanging over the doorway, and under it, as large as life, stood Mrs Pepperpot. "Darling husband," she said, and she put her arms around his neck and gave him a great big smacking kiss. "Happy Christmas!" The end. Wow, what a super duper story today. We've just shared the story of Mrs Pepperpot's Christmas. I hope you've enjoyed it. Thank you for watching Christmas Story Time, and hopefully I'll see you again very soon. Take care. Bye!